Good morning. I have great news for you. Today we're preaching about money. No, hold your applause. I have more to say. I know you woke up this morning and you were like, I really hope I get to go to a church where the pastor talks about money. That'd be great. I want to go and hear a message about my money and what I should be doing with it. That would be great. That would be great. Well, you're welcome. Welcome to Aletheia. We're here to please. You know, that we wanted to make sure that for the new year there was plenty of room to grow. So we'll just blast some seats right open just with this message. So good morning. Just before we get started, let's pray and ask God to help us, yeah? Father God, thank you so much for this time together. Father, thank you for my friends, for the men and women who are sitting in these seats. God, I thank you that from eternity past, you saw this moment, you knew this moment, you ordained this moment, God. Now, God, speak to us. Speak to us, Lord. Just as we sang this morning, you are holy, and the earth is yours, and everything therein. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. So, God, we pray in your fullness and in our lack, come and speak to us in the name of Jesus. Amen. Okay, so we start a new series today called The Real Wealth Gap, which I'm really excited about, mainly because I just love the graphic, and I could just sort of stare at it for a while. So the same art department that you guys poo-pooed on a little later, I think did a great job here. Just so you know, I'm the art department. So if you ever don't like it, Donnie designed it. But for the good stuff, I did it. So the real wealth gap, we're talking about the real wealth gap because if you own a television or a computer, if you at all interface with the news, if you haven't been living under a rock for the last year or 5, then you will have noticed that we are living in a time where this idea of wealth gaps, the wealth gap, the gap supposedly in society between the richest among us and the poorest among us, is kind of making a popularity comeback. It's kind of, I mean, I'll be honest, between, while I was in college and up until about, 4 or 5 years ago, this wasn't something that was in my lexicon. I didn't really talk or hear many other people talk about the wealth gap. But in the heated political environment in which we live, yes, money and politics in the same sermon. This is going to be great for you. In the heated political environment in which we live, we are all quite sensitive to the sensing that we all share as humanity about economic justice, about everyone getting a fair shake, about everyone being provided for. And so we come up with terminology to describe what we sense to be the problem like this: the wealth gap. The wealth gap is assumed to be this gap between those who have lots of riches and those who have very few riches. And in looking at this gap and everyone agreeing, oh yes, this is a problem, then our political system splits in half, and the more liberal politicians among us say, well, what we need to do is take from those with many riches and give to those with fewer riches and spread it around a little bit so that the wealth gap shrinks and everyone has a little bit more equal shake at life. And then the conservative wing comes over and says, no, we don't need to take that. We need to spread not around wealth, we need to spread around opportunity. And then we have bickering and back and forth, and then we have tea parties and Occupy parties, and we have all kinds of parties, none of which I was invited to, by the way. When you're a pastor, you don't get invited to parties for some reason, but all of it, we see everyone kind of grasping and trying to figure out politically, motivationally, educationally, what are we going to do about this problem of the wealth gap? And I think behind this idea, there's a hidden assumption that I think is wrong, a hidden assumption that I think is very wrong, a hidden assumption that I think God looks at and says, no, that is wrong. And the assumption is this, that riches equal human flourishing. That more wealth, that if we have more stuff, if we're more socially mobile, if we've got more money to spend on things, then that leads to greater human flourishing. That's the assumption behind the idea that this wealth gap between those with many riches and those with very few riches is a problem even in the first place. And I think that's wrong. I'm pretty sure the scriptures do too. And so what I want to suggest to you this morning and for the next few weeks as we go through this series, that the real wealth gap isn't so much the gap between those with few riches and those with many riches, though indeed that does create problems. I think the deeper problem behind the problem isn't the gap between few riches and great riches. It's the gap between true riches and false riches. See, the real problem behind the wealth gap is not less or more money. The real problem is, what is wealth? What is truly riches? Now, the reason I've got some arguments other than just the scripture to try and suggest to you that perhaps the simple accumulating of more money and more wealth and more power for ourselves doesn't actually satisfy us, doesn't actually lead to greater human flourishing, because we live in the richest society ever known to exist on the planet. And us in our richest society have now crested $15 trillion in debt. That means each one of you owes almost $50,000, your little children too, to foreign creditors, because we as a nation have decided that as long as we buy more stuff, as long as we have more stuff, then we'll be a better nation. We can do more programs, we can do more things. So let's go ahead and get out the national credit card and start running that thing up so that we can have more and be better. And yet, what has it led to? A divided political environment, unhappy people, lots of red ink. What we find at the pot of gold at the end of this rainbow of the pursuit of wealth, as though that we're going to actually make life better, is no pot of gold at all. It's a pot of broken promises and red ink. I suggest to you, I submit to you, and I ask you to consider the crazy possibility that the problem with our culture, the problem with world culture, and the problem in our own heart isn't the fact that our hearts don't have access to enough wealth. Oh, sure, we need to deal with that. But how foolish would it be for us to all gain riches and lack the proper character to steward them? How foolish would it be for us to have all the wealth in the world and mistake that for true riches? Mistake that for true riches. So now that I've angered everyone sufficiently, we'll go on. Don't believe me, though. Let's believe Jesus. We'll be in the book of Luke, chapter 19, so let's go there. Luke 19, verse 1. This is a story about Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. If any of you laughed at that, then you just revealed the fact that you grew up in church. So there you go. Now we know who grew up going to the Sunday school class with the lady, with the dress and the flannel graph. I remember the flannel graph. I remember the smell of the flannel graph. It takes me back. Okay. Luke 19, chapter 1. Let's read together. He entered Jericho and was passing through, and there was a man named Zacchaeus. He, that is Jesus, was passing through Jericho. And there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was small of stature, which is a nice euphemistic way of saying he was a pretty short guy. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." And he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, that is the crowd, they all grumbled. "He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner." Well, and Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." I'm going to engage in just a little bit of what I think is good historically based speculation, but I want to climb into this story just a little bit and ask you to join me in first century Palestine and think of what it was like to be Zacchaeus as a little guy. So here's Zacchaeus. Growing up in first century Palestine, he was a Jew, probably very poor, because if you weren't extremely wealthy in those times, then you were subsistence living. You were very poor. And so Zacchaeus, I would imagine, grew up like maybe some of us did, and was the son of, tenant workers, probably saw mom and dad struggle every day, and grew up being poor, grew up not having enough, grew up watching mom and dad struggle to feed their family, struggle to make payments on rent, struggle to meet their obligations financially, and he probably grew up in the environment of stress and pain and worry that brings about. Maybe some of you, that's a very familiar circumstance. Maybe when you grew up, you remember looking at mom and dad sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the checkbook going, okay, I just don't know how it's going to happen. And that's very much how Zacchaeus was, except even more. Zacchaeus grew up in a place that had been conquered over and over and over and over again. So not only was he like being, just regular poor, he was poor in spirit. His whole family, his whole nation, the people that were supposed to be God's people had been conquered and conquered and conquered and conquered. And so there he was living in Jericho. I don't know if you remember the city of Jericho at all, but Jericho was the site of some great and amazing miracles when just a few thousand years before, Joshua led the army of God around the city. The walls fell down and God gave them the city. And at one time, that city was full of promise and full of hope and full of vision and full of future. And now, as Zacchaeus is a little guy, not so much. Not so much, because over and over and over and over again, them and their people had been conquered. And at this time, they were conquered by the final of the great empires in that day, the Roman Empire. And when you were an empire and you conquered another country, it became a vassal state. And what vassal state literally means is that they basically paid a huge amount of tribute to you. A huge amount of the wealth of that nation would come to Rome so that they could keep Judea poor enough not to rebel. You get me? Okay, it's a horrible thing to do, but it's a pretty smart idea if you're interested in creating vassal states. And so this was very much what would happen. And so Zacchaeus would grow up and he would see mom and dad, and I can imagine Zacchaeus looking around and saying, I hate this. I hate this. When I grow up, I'm going to have money. When I grow up, I'm going to make sure my mom's taken care of. When I grow up, I'm going to make sure that if mom's shoes have a hole in them, I'm going to get something. When I grow up and I make some money, I'm going to take care of my brothers and sisters. I can imagine Zacchaeus sitting there looking, just as a young boy, looking around at the poverty around him and the pain around him, going, I don't like this. Not a bad impulse, not a bad thing. But right there in the presence of real need, a new idol was crafted. See, where we're going today is this idea that the real wealth gap isn't the gap between less riches and more riches, but between true riches and false riches. True riches and false riches. Before we talk about money, before we talk about godly principles for laying out your finances and stewardship and generosity, which, by the way, we're going to talk about all of that, we first must put money in its proper place, because whether you know it or not, you live in a society that deifies it. Looks to money and says, money. As soon as I have, then I'll be. As soon as I have enough this, then I'll finally be that. And that is exactly the transaction of thought that went on in young Zacchaeus' mind. I guarantee it, because what Zacchaeus did gives testimony to the fact that he pursued money more than anything else. You see, Zacchaeus was a Jew by birth. Jews at that time were understood to be God's covenant people. But when he looked across and he saw the poverty around him, he said, I will do whatever it takes to get myself out of this situation. You see, what we're really talking about today is idolatry. I'm sure you woke up this morning and thought, I wonder if we're going to talk about idolatry, money and idolatry. That would be great. Could we do money, politics, and idolatry in the same sermon? That would be excellent. Well, yes, we are. Idolatry, the idea that we create for ourselves little functional gods to get us out of the little personal hells that we fear the most. And for Zacchaeus, hell was being poor. And he was prepared to do whatever he had to do to make sure he was never there again. Perhaps some of you have grown up in the kind of place, have lived in the kind of environment where you looked around you and you saw brokenness, you saw poverty, you saw stuff like that, and you said, never again, I will do whatever it takes so that I don't have to be here. And so you find yourself here in Boston, going to one of our great universities or working at one of our great companies around here, trying to make sure that you never end up in the hell you fear most. And so you bow down and worship and give time, talent, treasure, and devotion to get what you really want out of life, which is this functional savior of money. Just like Zacchaeus did. How do we know Zacchaeus did this? Well, because it says here that he was a tax collector. Now, to be a tax collector was to work for the Roman government. So think about this. Rome has come in and conquered your people, conquered your family, subjugated your friends and neighbors, made some of them slaves. The pretty young ladies among you, you've been taken to be concubines of the local governor for sure. Now, you young men, you're not going to make as much because the taxes on you are going to be levied higher. And the dudes who collect the taxes are going to be drawn from your own midst. They're going to be turncoats. They're going to be liars. They're going to be people who turn their back on their own people. And that's precisely what Zacchaeus was. Nobody liked Zacchaeus. And I would imagine Zacchaeus didn't care much. You know why? Because he was rich. He was rich. He did not care much what people thought. He cared much that he never entered that hell that he grew up in again. And so he decided that it would be a good idea to turn his back on his friends, family, and neighbors, on his nation, on the promises of God, and indeed on the true and living God who is there. Put his back to them and put his face to the God of money and be willing to subjugate his friends and neighbors to get it. So here's how tax collectors would work. The Roman army would be in your town, walking around, looking very Roman army. I don't know, hat with the big thing. I don't know, capes. You've seen the videos, something like that, I'm sure. The Roman army was the fiercest fighting force in the world, and then the Roman army would appoint tax collectors to levy taxes and gain the wealth of the nation and send it back to Rome, but tax collectors were allowed to take a little off the top. Now today we call this extortion, and we hope, at least, it doesn't happen very often, but back then we called it business. And so every so often, every 3 or 4 months, everyone in the town of Jericho would line up at Zacchaeus' table and start paying him. One for me, one for Rome. One for me, one for Rome. And he, to serve the God of money, was willing to watch all of his friends become more poor and more poor. And then it says something else, that he wasn't just a tax collector, he was the chief tax collectors. He was like the pimp of tax collectors. He had tax collectors working under him that he took money from. It was like a pyramid scheme from hell. Do you know what I mean? Like he was the guy who oversaw the guys who ruined your life, okay? So, I realize maybe this is a stretch because I know today we love tax collectors and we think that they've got a great job, and all of us are really excited about people who work for the IRS who take our money. If any of you do work for the IRS, don't worry, we'll pray for you at the end. There's a chance to repent at the end of every service. I'm just kidding, kind of. So let's see what happens. He was a chief tax collector and he was rich. He was rich. He was willing to do whatever he had to do to get money. I'm curious, if I asked you to imagine this. Imagine I snap my fingers, and at the snap of my fingers, every worldly possession that you have, every good, every TV, couch, every dime you have to your name was gone. Okay, how do you feel? Are you freaking out? You worried a little bit? Concerned? The way you know you have an idol is by testing out what your life would be like without it. Imagine all of your money is gone. What do you do? For some of you, that would be hell. That would be me sending you back to the place you've been fighting all of your life to avoid, and it would be hell for you. Okay, now imagine this. Imagine I snap my fingers again. And the next time you go to the ATM and you hit check balance, you find at least 12 extra zeros on the number that you weren't aware of. Here, 12 zeros, what are they doing here? You are all of a sudden rich beyond your wildest imagination, such that in 10 lifetimes you couldn't spend the amount of money that you had. How do you feel? I'll tell you how you feel. Half y'all just smiled real big. What does that reveal? What we hope for? What we want? What would really satisfy our hearts? You see, money and the pursuit of money, the pursuit of wealth, if money, if earthly riches are the thing for which we are in fact living, the thing in which we take comfort, and the thing without which we would find ourselves freaking out and in a personal hell, then you may have a small reason to suspect the possibility that you're not so different than Zacchaeus, wee little man as he was. You may not be so different. But see, the thing about money, it's an idol. But as Tim Keller notes in his book, Counterfeit Gods, which is a great book that many of you should read, money is an idol, but it's kind of a surfacey idol. It's kind of a surfacey idol. What we do with it reveals what he calls the deep idols. I'll give you an example. There were 2 businessmen who graduated from Harvard Business School. Graduated the same year, best of friends, came out. They'd each saved up all of their money and invested together as partners, having equal shares in a new software company. They developed a piece of software that was extremely valuable and were, at the age of about 32, able to sell their software company for about $500 million, each of them splitting the profit and now becoming wealthier than they had ever imagined to be, younger than they had ever hoped. The first gentleman took his money and lived a very modest life. Meager, lived in a very normal house, wore very normal clothes, still took the bus, still rode on the T, seemed to be a very normal fella. And then the other guy, all of a sudden, bling everywhere, shiny things, BMWs, Lamborghinis, fancy trips, nice houses, great big parties. And I ask you now, which one of the 2 was an idolater? The answer is both. They both idolized money, but their deeper idols were different. For the one, the guy who holds his money, for the guy who takes wealth and misers it and keeps it and finds security in it, his idol of money really just reveals a deeper and truer idol of control. Control. So they try to control the world around them with their money. They give gifts that always have strings attached to them. You ever met any of these people? They have lots of wealth. They do things with their money such that they will make sure that come rain or shine, winter or fall, I will be secure because I've got my pile of money right here. Thank you very much. Some of us think that to be an idolater of money means to spend, spend, spend. Well, perhaps, but if you spend, 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 then maybe your idol isn't money so much as it is the approval of others. So that when they see your latest gadget, gizmo, whiz-bangery in your life, the cool new clothes, the party that you have, they look at you and go, wow. And then you feel like something. See, what we do with it reveals the deep idols. And I can imagine for Zacchaeus, the deep idol was probably more like the idol of control. More like the idol of control. Growing up as a young, poor Palestinian Jew under Roman occupation, he probably felt like his whole life was spinning out of control. He probably watched his dad and his mom work themselves to the bone. And really, he was after money, but not money so much as control. So that now that he had money, now that he had wealth, now that he had power and position in society, now he could really control his life, control his destiny, because he is the master of his own ship, the captain of his own destiny, as Invictus has taught us, right? And so, what we read next is very, very peculiar in light of all of that. It says, he heard Jesus was coming, and he was seeking to see who Jesus was. Now, Jesus himself said that rich people don't typically seek to see who Jesus was. If you have lots of money, if you have lots of wealth, if you're very secure in what you have right now, Jesus says it's not a sin to have money. Money isn't itself evil, but if you have lots of it, then you're probably less aware of your spiritual poverty. Again, lots of riches are not necessarily the same as true riches. Just because you have lots of wealth does not mean that you are in fact wealthy. But for many who do have a lot of wealth, that's how they feel. I grew up in a family and surrounded by people with quite a bit of money. And now, my family was moderately successful, but because my dad was a golfer and a very good golfer, and therefore got invited to lots of golf things, which is typically populated by people with lots of money because it costs an outrageous amount of money to play golf where we were from, I got to go and play golf with him. Now, let me just asterisk that with a completely aside point. I'm terrible at golf. Terrible at it. I'm great at select shot golf tournaments. But if you have one and you go, oh, Adam, no. If I could trade my golf and bowling scores, life would be better for me. But I can't, okay? I'm not so great at golf. But I would go and play these tournaments with my dad because, I like hanging out with my dad. And so we would go and I'd woof it and then he'd rescue us and it would be great. But in those golf tournaments that I must have gone to 150 of them with him as I grew up, I got to be around a lot of rich old men. Rich, typically quite fat, old men. Suspenders, cigars, whatever your mental picture is, whatever your stereotypical, yes, that guy. I know that guy. I grew up with that guy. Those guys came to our wedding. Like, those were our neighbors. We know lots of those guys in my family, and that's not necessarily a great thing. But what I did get to see with my own eyes were men who gave their whole life gaining wealth, who'd hit retirement, be on their second or third spouse, and were very, very unhappy. Very, very, very unhappy. And I remember noting it, even as a young man, just kind of going like, this is interesting. They drive away in the fancy car. Now listen, let me just be really clear. Money is not a sin to have. Fancy cars aren't sin. Big houses aren't sin. It's not wrong to take wonderful vacations and to buy gifts for all of your friends. It's not wrong to have lots of zeros at the end of your bank balance. Not wrong at all, but it is wrong to worship it. Money is a wonderful tool. It's a terrible God. It is a very great tool to worship God. It's a horrible, horrible deity. And those who pursue it as such will find out in the end. And I can imagine that's actually where Zacchaeus landed, because we just read this really peculiar passage that he was seeking to see Jesus. And then he does something really weird, which if any of you have known any quite wealthy, not necessarily new money wealthy people, but old money wealthy people, stately status kind of wealthy people, imagine that guy that you grew up with, or that woman, the lady with the big brooch, the lady who has tea parties, okay, you got her in your mind? Okay, imagine her doing this. She ran up a tree to see Jesus. All right, you there? Have you just pictured your, great aunt Matilda, with all of her wealth, climbing up the tree to see Jesus? No, of course that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen normally. And yet, I think Zacchaeus probably, after he'd abandoned everyone, after he'd put his back to everyone, after he had finally gotten what he really wanted out of life, money, he realized that it wasn't nearly as great as he imagined it is. Because this is the thing with idols. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't, if you worship anything other than God. Because if money is your idol and you don't have it, what are you? You're sad, you're unhappy, you're in your personal hell of poverty and not having quite enough as whoever else you're comparing yourself to. And then when you finally get it, when you finally obtain earthly riches and you finally get all of the zeros, you know what? After all of the vacations are done, after all of the houses have been built, after all of the jewelry has been bought, after all the TVs have surrounded your walls, you come to the end of your rope and you realize that you are more unhappy than when you started, because money is a terrible, terrible God. We know this. We have a whole book of the Bible about this. It's called Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is written with the tongue firmly in the cheek. Okay, it's a whole book. It's like my fighter book for being sarcastic myself. I love kind of the book of Ecclesiastes because here we have Solomon, King Solomon. Okay, just so you know, King Solomon, richest, wisest, most powerful, most successful guy in the world. Okay, he had more wives than anyone we can possibly imagine. He had more concubines than anyone we could possibly imagine. He did public works projects. He had wisdom granted to him from God. He was the king of a nation. He commanded an army. He got to do whatever he wanted to do. And then when he got to the end of it all, he said one day, you know what? I'm going to live for pleasure. I'm going to pursue to my maximal ability all of my pleasure in all of my things. And he said, when I got to the end of all of it, I looked at it and it was vanity, a chasing after the wind, and nothing was to be gained under the sun. Do you realize if your God is something under the sun, your life is vanity? But for Zacchaeus, his God had come from beyond the sun. And he realized, as in the words of Solomon, that he no doubt heard growing up as a young poor Jewish boy around Jericho, hey, wait a minute. Maybe Solomon was onto something. Here I have everything I could ever imagine. But he began to realize that the real wealth gap isn't between few riches and many. It's between true riches and false. And so something in him realized that there was something more to life. Something in him was beginning to cry out. And something in him, something happening on the inside of Zacchaeus, caused Zacchaeus to stop what he was doing, walking around. And listen, when you were walking around in those days, your robes told everyone who you are. Not terribly different than today. But what you wore told everyone where you were and who you were. And trust me, people hated Zacchaeus enough to know exactly who he was. And yet here we find this man of dignified social status zooming up a tree to see some poor rabbi. I guarantee you that when he climbed up that tree, he thought, I am the rich man Zacchaeus, and here I'm going to see this poor vagabond Jesus teacher. And yet something happened. Something Zacchaeus could have never imagined. He ran on ahead and climbed into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry down, for I must stay at your house today. I cannot imagine what was going through his mind at that time. I cannot imagine what Zacchaeus was thinking when he climbed up the tree and the teacher that he was looking to see. Perhaps it was just curiosity. Perhaps it was just interest. But John Calvin says something very, very interesting about curiosity. He says that curiosity and simplicity are a sort of preparation for faith. And this curious, simple desire that sent Zacchaeus zooming up a tree caused Jesus to come and see him. Interesting. Zacchaeus came. I can only imagine. Perhaps Zacchaeus was thinking, oh, well, perhaps Jesus has heard of me. I am, of course, a bit of a big deal. I'm Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus Tax Consultants, LLC, that's me. Everyone's seen my billboards. Everyone knows I'm the guy with the obnoxious homemade commercial in between the game. Everyone knows me, right? Everyone knows that I'm Zacchaeus. I'm the guy who takes care of the state finances. I'm sure at that point Zacchaeus had reasoned to himself that what he did was really a service to everyone, that if someone else was doing it, maybe they would take more money, maybe it would be worse for them, and Zacchaeus would probably thought, hey, maybe Jesus has heard of me. I realize he's probably a poor, vagabond kind of teacher going to and fro, doesn't really look like he has much. Maybe he wants some money for his ministry. Maybe he's heard of me. See, he climbed up that tree thinking that he was wealthy, and Jesus was poor. But when he climbed down, something happened. He realized it was entirely the other way around. He realized it was entirely the other way around. And Zacchaeus was told, by Jesus, hurry down, I must come to your house today. And it says that he led him there joyfully. He received Jesus joyfully. You know, it's interesting. Some of you are here this morning, and maybe this is your first time in church, or your second time in church in a long time. Welcome. I'm really glad that you're here. And maybe for you, this is kind of a climbing up a tree.